how might spirituality be experienced? Now, I've heard some people say spirituality is walking on the ocean and feeling the ocean breeze, walking on the shores of the ocean and feeling the ocean breeze. That's something which is spiritual, just feeling the wind go through your body, through your hair, that's spiritual. Some people say the feeling of love towards another person, love towards a child, your child, a grandchild, a relative, that's something that's very spiritual. Some people say spirituality is watching a baby being born, a new life. You know, they all might be correct answers, but they're really physical sensations. And even if it's spiritual, it's fleeting. It doesn't really last. And the reason for that is because we are ensconced in the material. And as we will see at this coming slide, our default consciousness is the physical, the bodily senses. We're very aware of that. We're aware if, God forbid, we have an ache or a pain. We're aware when we feel good. When we're hungry, we have a sensation and we want to eat. When we pass by a bakery that bakes some very good challah, and it's Friday and we sniff in the odor, it's something which is very delightful, but it's very material. So most of our experience and also most of our occupation in our 24-hour period is based on physical activity and physical needs or physical desires. Even going to sleep and resting is a physical activity. There are spiritual dimensions to it as well, but it's physical. So that in itself causes us to draw to physical and sort of like negate the spiritual and not even pursue the spiritual. Then the second thing is that we live in an environment where the society basically pursues material gain. The symbol of success is by how much materialism we have, not in spirituality necessarily. So again, we are surrounded by physical desires that we don't even have time to think about spiritual. So when we ask the question, how do you define spirituality? The question really is a question that is not necessarily practical because a lot of people don't even deal with it. There are people that deal with it. I'm not trying to generalize. Sometimes a person feels the call of the soul. Somebody once went on a date and told me, I found my soulmate. But how do you know what the soulmate is if you don't know what your soul is? The person might have made you feel very good and very complete. You enjoyed that person's company, but that may not have anything to do with spirituality. It may be totally that you feel good, physical, you feel good being with that other person. So what is spirituality? And that's something that we need to explore. And it may seem distant from us, but our hope is that when we get through this lesson, lesson 2, we will have a much better understanding of what it is and how we can relate to it. And the truth of the matter is that we will discover in this class that the true essence of our being is spirituality. It's there innately. And the fact that we cover it up with the material world doesn't negate the truth that the essence is spirituality. And we're going to give several examples. We're going to build it with building blocks. So the first building block that we want to talk about is the body and the soul. Now, we know that every human being has a body and a soul, no matter what your definition of the soul is, whether it's the life that energizes it. Some people think the soul is only there when you live and it doesn't exist after that, which is not exactly the Jewish interpretation of things. But nevertheless, for argument's sake, we all know that the human being is not just flesh and bones, and it's not just our mind and heart. There is a soul that gives us life. If you give a look on page 39, there's a question, which is an exercise 2.2. When somebody asks you the question, how do you describe yourself? What goes through your mind if you have to answer it? If I would put before you a piece of paper and say, write in one paragraph a description of yourself, what would you write?
Character traits.
Some people will write character traits, which is nice, but that's how we deal with each other. Some people will record passion. Some people will record their intelligence. Some people will record their acquired knowledge. Some people will record their station in life. All of that is fine, but that still doesn't describe the essence of who we are. That describes how our essence manifests itself in the world. So for that reason, we need to actually look in the Torah to see what it says. I see what Scott wrote. This is not a question about religion. This is a question about the essence of who we are. And it's about life itself. So let's give a look on page 40, text number 1. This is taken from Genesis. And many of you that have attended JLI have seen this verse. And if not, it's a very well-known verse. In one of the descriptions of the creation of the first human being, which was Adam and Eve, God says in Genesis, God formed the human from dust of the ground, and he breathed into the human's nostrils the soul of life. This is very unique to human beings. Human beings were created differently than the rest of creation. When God created the rest of creation, according to the Torah narrative, the Torah description, God said, let there be light. And with those words that God uttered, let there be light, light came into being. Or if God wanted to create the heavens, he said, let there be the firmament. And with that, it was created. Let there be the earth, let it sprout forth. Everything came into being. When God created animals, which are the closest to humans because they have a body, they have a flesh, they have some sort of life force, he also created them with one word. And he actually created body and soul at the same time. In other words, the soul was the power that created the body. Not so the human being. Because the human being, as we just read, God took the earth of the ground and formed clay of the earth and formed the shape of a human being. With that, he formed the body. And then God brought in the soul. The soul was the breath that came from the essence of God. And it's interesting that the commentaries say, primarily Rashi, that the human was different than every other creature because the human combined the two opposite poles. On the one hand, it came from the lowest material, which was the earth, and yet it had the highest level of godliness where God imbued within it a divine soul. So when we talk about spirituality as an example, we have to come to the concept that there's a body and a soul, but the human is a little different. And why do we start with the human? If everything has a body and soul, why are we starting with the human? Because there's nothing that doesn't have a body and soul. It can't exist, as we're going to see a little bit later in the lesson. The reason is because we are addressing humans, and the humans are the only ones that have a dual consciousness. We have a duality within ourselves. And the duality is that we have contradictory drives. The animal only has one drive, and that is to survive. The animal only has one goal in life, and that is to keep itself alive and to keep its family alive. But the human being has dual drives. On the one hand, the human being could be in an environment which is very materialistic, and at that point, they yearn for materialism. They want to enrich their lives in a material way. And then they can be in a godly environment, and then they suddenly feel that their soul, their godliness, the divine aspect of them comes to life, and that's what's very important. So much so that for many, many years, for many centuries, in fact, many people thought that the nature of a human being is one of contradictions, a little bit of a schizophrenia kind of operation. And they couldn't feel totally spiritual if they still had material desires. And they felt that their spirituality or their yearning for godliness and spirituality was fraudulent because of the fact that they didn't wipe away all the materialism or all the materialistic desires. The truth of the matter is that there are very few people that actually can live to that level, to that standard, where there's no desire for materialism. Those are what we refer to as tzaddikim. And tzaddikim are the righteous ones, which there are very few in creation that are defined as a tzaddik. And a tzaddik is not only someone that acts in a very spiritual way, but a tzaddik is one that doesn't have a struggle. There's no duality. Their single consciousness is that they have conquered their body, they've conquered their physical and their animal part, and they have transformed it, that it too wants godliness. But since that is such a rarity, it's not something that we will address. We're addressing us, the simple people, the regular people. So we'll eventually take this concept of body as soul and apply it to everything else in creation. But right now we're going to talk about the human being, because we're still trying to feel what is spirituality. So what we're going to suggest here is that spirituality within the human experience is actually the breath of God, which is our life force. The breath of God, which becomes our soul, which is part of our existence, our being, which is not animalistic at all. It's not something that connects to the physical. It is pure. And actually, we have a prayer for it. If you turn to if you're on page 40 and you go look in text 2, this is a prayer from the morning blessings. You remember last week in the first lesson, we did a little exercise at the end of the lesson, talking about some of the blessings that are recited in the morning to make ourselves aware of our consciousness on a deeper level. Well, this is a blessing that precedes all those other blessings. We're only going to read a very short line, a one-liner out of it. And this is exactly the way it is found in the prayer book. And it says, my God, Elokai, we're talking to God as my God that relates to me. The soul you have placed within me is pure. What does it mean that the soul that you've placed in me is pure? It's pure godliness. It's pure godliness that transcends the physical, the material, or anything that the physical and material represents. It's pure in every way. It's a part of God that's within us. But then the question is, if it's part of God, how does it dwell within our bodies? How does it become married to the body? How does it become one with us? And for that, the verse continues in the prayer and says, you created it. In other words, you brought it through the world of creation where it became an entity, even though it's still godly. And then you formed it, which allowed it to acclimate to the physical. And then you did the final act, which you breathed it into me, and now it's with me. So in other words, the soul descends from the highest level, and it goes through these contractions, if we can say, that it's filtered. In the Kabbalistic vernacular, it's called a tzimtzum, which reduces it. The essence remains the same, but it doesn't remain in its full glory, so that it should be able to acclimate itself to the body and interface and bond with the body. So what we learn from here is that within each and every human being, beyond the body, there is the soul. Now, the soul is not just the life force, because the life force is the most physical part of the soul, which is just about survival as well. But there is that godly, divine aspect of the soul, which has a yearning to connect with God and lift us into being one with God.
Yeah.
Just 1 second. So when we search through the texts of the Torah to see how a soul is actually described, there's a fascinating book of Mishlei called the Proverbs, which was written by Shlomo HaMelech, by King Solomon, and he says there that Ner Hashem Nishmat Adam. That's text 3 on page 41. That the human soul is the candle of God. Now, what is he trying to say that it's the candle of God? So there are many explanations and there are many layers to it. What does it mean that it's a candle? A soul illuminates, a soul is fire, a soul is divine, just like fire is the least physical entity because fire doesn't take up any space, it's energy. The same thing is true with the soul. The soul is energy. But there's one particular example that we would like to focus on, and that is on page 42, text 4. And this is written by Rabbi Shneur Zalman Vladin. He writes the following. When you think about a flame, which that's the candle, he says the nature of a flame is to flicker upward, indicating that the flame intrinsically seeks to part from its wick in order to unite with its source above. What does that mean? When you look at a flame, you'll always see the flame going upwards. For whatever reasons that science gives, but according to Judaism, it's because the energy of the flame is so refined that it wants to be connected to its source. Even if you would take this candle and turn it sideways, the flame would go upwards. Even if you turn it upside down, the flame will want to go upwards because it yearns to connect with its source. And that's the dancing flame, the flickering flame, or the calm flame, but it's always yearning upwards. And that is one of the examples that we find in the comparison between a flame and the human soul. And he continues in the next paragraph, and he says, similarly, the human soul naturally desires and yearns to separate itself and escape its body in order to unite with its origin and source in God, the blessed source of all life. This is something which is hard to understand because usually we speak about life, that life is all about self-preservation, and a person wants to live. But if you would examine the soul, because the soul is a totally non-material entity, and if you look at the soul, the energy of the soul, the energy of the soul is that it wants to float upwards. It feels its connection. So this is something which is very important for us to understand, that there is this battle between the body and the soul. The body is pursuing materialism. The body is pursuing material pleasures, material needs, things that are absolutely necessary in order to live, no question about it. But the soul has a different interest. The soul's interest is to be connected to its source. The soul's interest is to be connected to God, to be in its environment of godliness. Now, when you take a soul and put it into a very spiritual environment, it's fine. Now, why does the soul not leave the body? After all, the soul is more powerful than the body. So even though it has a yearning to ascend, but it knows that it was given a purpose, it was given a mission. And the mission is to live in this world and to fulfill what God wants it to do. But once it gets involved in its mission, it suddenly realizes that it's become too physical and it wants to go back up. And there's a description in the Tanakh where it speaks about the angels, and it's very similar to the human souls as well, that it says, V'achayot ratzol v'shuv, they're running and they're returning. What does it mean they're running? If you were able to examine the soul through a machine, through a scanner, and you would see the movement of the soul, you would see that the soul is constantly trying to yearn upwards to connect, and then it settles down in the body. It's ratzui v'shuv, it's up and down. And in fact, that is expressed in breath, because breath is also up and down. Breathing in and breathing out. That's why breathing is a very strong and powerful meditative tool to allow us to focus. It allows us to focus on the soul, allows us to focus on ourselves. So the soul is trying to reach upwards. The body says to the soul, you have a mission. You need to be with me. And for that reason, it doesn't leave. So now let's talk about the practicality of this. We talk about the soul being part of God, the soul having the yearn to be godly, to allow the soul to dominate, to be in touch with it. How do we get there? So there are 2 steps, and each of these steps have become very significant in the Jewish meditative experience. In reality, in the olden days, the first step was probably more prevalent than the second step that we're going to introduce today. In today's times, the second step is more pronounced, more prominent, more practical. A little bit of the first step is also necessary. So one of the things that people find that's causing them the biggest challenge to be able to reach into their inner self is the myriads of distractions that are out there. And what constitutes a distraction? In some cases, a distraction may be noise. In some cases, distraction may be desires that go in the wrong places. Imagine Shabbat afternoon, you can't come home from services, you had a nice lunch, you sit down and you want to study, and all of a sudden your neighbor decides to bring in the landscape company, and they have these very loud leaf blowers that, besides the fact that they pollute, they just make just this terrible noise that the operators have to wear earplugs. And they're doing it right outside your window, and you're trying to focus. It would be kind of difficult. But that's external noise. There's a lot of internal noise that people have. Internal noise are worries. Internal noise are pursuits. Internal noise are not disciplining themselves to be able to concentrate. There could be a lot of reasons why there's internal noise. So for that reason, the most common way that the early mystics would meditate was actually by the act of subtraction. That's called spiritually by subtraction. What I would call it is the meditation of departure. We depart from ourselves. And in fact, what many people would do is they would go out to a quiet place out in the woods, out in the forest, where there was no outside worries. Many of them took very little food because they wanted to also negate the body. They felt that the body is an obstruction to their spiritual pursuit. How can you pursue God when at the same time you want to eat or you want to have some flavorful food? That's feeding the body. You really want to train yourself to have only the spiritual experience. So what people would do is they would go in isolation, as you see in this picture of this lone house being out in the wilderness and just being alone there and being able to be mitboded. We find that the Baal Shem Tov did it, and many of the other mystics in the past would do that. This is what's called hitbodedut. Hitbodedut comes from the word, as we mentioned last week, it comes from the word bidud, as we will soon see. Bidud is, or boded, means to be in isolation, to be quarantined. In fact, I mentioned last week, just to repeat again, that in the common time of the COVID virus, the most common word in Israel was bidud. Who has to go into quarantine? Quarantine is bidud. This bidud here, hitbodedut, is placing oneself willingly into this isolation of external distractions and isolation of internal distractions. So therefore, it would take a tremendous amount of discipline and say to the body, You have no power over me. You have no control over me. I will not give in to any of your desires. I will not, I will do a lot of self-negation. I will submit myself to God. I will not allow the physical to intrude. It says actually in the Mishnah that in the early generations of the Hasidim, not to confuse with the Hasidic movement that we talk about, which is a later phenomena, but there were Hasidim that were in the time of the Mishnah. So we talked about them last week that they would meditate for an hour before prayer, but it says that they would actually starve themselves. And it wasn't for health reasons like intermittent fasting. Could be that was a benefit as well. They starved themselves just to negate their physical body. So for instance, if the normal routine was to eat breakfast at 8 o'clock in the morning, that was the normal time that everybody ate breakfast, they would wait till 10 o'clock just to train their body that the body has no control over them. Or they would go out for 3 days into the forest with just a little water and fast and teach themselves discipline that the body should have no control over them. That was a form of preparation for Hitbodedut. And if we give a look, the son of Rambam, Maimonides' son was known as Rabbi Avram ben Harambam, who actually helped codify a lot of his father's, translate a lot of his father's works. So he writes, if you give a look on page 43, in text 5, he says, Hitbodedut, which is seclusion, is one of the most superior of all distinguished practices. It is a practice of the greatest saints and the medium through which the prophets experienced revelation. What are we talking about here? We're talking about here a seclusion which allows the person to distance themselves from material distractions, and then they can focus totally on the spiritual. Now, not everybody can do that. There were certain mystics that were able to do that. As an example, there was a Hasidic Rebbe known as the Mazatcher Rebbe, who was a great composer of music. And he was able to negate his body to the extent that one time when he was having surgery, and I don't even know if there was anesthesia at that time, he said, don't give me any anesthesia. And he composed 40 stanzas of classical music while the surgeons were operating on him. And he felt no pain whatsoever. So it was an idea of removing himself from the physical, and in order to be able to focus on the spiritual, on the godliness. We also find, and I'm still going to bring it down to the level of the prophecy as well. We also find, if you give a look at page 44, taken from the Shalah, one of the famous writers of mysticism, Rabbi Yeshaya Hurwitz, and he writes that it's recorded in, that's text 6. He writes that it's recorded in many of the works of the medieval rabbis that seclusion, hitbodedut, separation from everything mundane, which is also called prishut, to separate, and devotional clinging, which is called devekut, or practiced by the pious Jews. This is to say that when they were alone, they would empty their minds of all worldly concerns and connect their minds with the master of all, the true existence, which is God. The famed Kabbalist, the Ari Zal, the Ari Zal means the Ari, may his memory be of blessing, taught that this practice is far more beneficial for the soul than study, and that every person should practice this seclusion meditation according to their ability, either once a week or once a fortnight, or at the very least once a month. Now, he doesn't mean that it's in the place of study, because obviously you have to be able to focus on something, and someone that's an ignoramus wouldn't be able to accomplish it. You know, they can accomplish discipline, but they have nothing to reach out to. So this seclusion and hitbodedut was a meditation of departure, to depart your environment and allow, through the meditation, to transcend your being and enter into another being, enter into another kind of existence, and to cling with God. And there were many sages that did that, and they did a lot of preparation of self-negation and surrendering to God, submitting themselves to God, thinking about the lowliness of the physical and trying to focus on the virtue of the spiritual and the godly and trying to connect to what God is. Now, I have to say what's missing right now is what they were focusing on. And that will come to in a minute, because that's more in the hitbonenut, in the contemplation. But as I said, in this practice, the emphasis is the departure to negate, to separate oneself from the physical environment. And this was something which is very mystical. And I want to say, you'll give a look on the screen where it says the root of divine inspiration of prophecy. Let me talk about this for a moment, because it's very much pertinent here. Judaism, in the early years after the people of Israel entered Israel, were accustomed to prophets. Who were the prophets? Now we know the greatest of all prophets was who? Moshe. Moshe was the greatest of prophets. In fact, it says when Moshe passed away that there never arose another prophet at the level of Moshe, that he spoke face to face to God. So what are some of the names of the famous prophets that you have heard of? We heard Jeremiah, Isaiah, Ezekiel, Amos, Jonah. There are so many prophets that are mentioned. Now, when you study Maimonides, and Maimonides was a pretty rational guy, right? Maimonides was a man and a virtue. He was a physician, he was a scientist, he was a philosopher. So in his Mishnah Torah, he has a section where he talks about the prophets. And he said, actually, in the time of the prophets, of Elijah the prophet, Elijah the prophet, there were thousands of people that were prophets in Israel. Now, none of their prophecy is recorded. And why is their prophecy not recorded? Because he says the only prophecy that was recorded was the prophecy that's pertinent to all future generations. But the prophecy that was only important to that time, that wasn't recorded. But he says something much deeper than that, which really revolutionizes what prophecy is. To us, prophecy is like a fortune teller, someone that can tell you what the future is. According to Maimonides, that's a byproduct of prophecy. That's not what prophecy is. Prophecy is this level of ascent where the person is able to transpose themselves from the physical existence into an entirely a spiritual existence. And he explains who is eligible and who can actually reach that. And he says, number one, these have to be people that have great intelligence. So the mind has to be totally engaged, and they have to acquire knowledge. They have to be wise. They have to study. It doesn't come from sitting on a rock on top of a mountain and closing your eyes. You have to engage your mind and study. And what the study is doing is you're studying the divine wisdom of God, especially the mystical aspect of God, which helps refine your mind, that your mind is now accepting more delicate ideas that are much more, that are superior to the material concepts. The second thing that he says is that they have to be in total control of their hearts. In other words, there cannot be that they have this impulsive behavior, or that they go after the heart and the heart controls the mind. It's just the opposite, as we read from the Zohar, Moach Shalit Alalef, that the mind controls the heart, that their entire body is in tune with their mind and what they're studying. So therefore, they are disciplined to the point where they don't even entertain a desire that's outside of the realm of purity. And then, through the wisdom and through the self-negation and through the constant focus on spirituality and godliness, perhaps they will merit to be able to understand and perceive the deeper insights of Torah. That's what the prophecy is. The prophecy is to be able to see what's beyond the surface. The prophecy is to see things that the naked eye cannot see, to be able to perceive. You mentioned Ezekiel before. Ezekiel spoke about the chariot. Ezekiel spoke about the visions that he saw. These were the visions of angels, the visions of the divine energy, that the only way he was able to describe it is in these physical human terms. So prophecy is actually a state of spiritual experience that the human can get to. And not all the sages or the students that did this actually arrived to that. Only those that were so spiritual and so pure and in harmony with their environment and harmony with each other were able to reach that. That is the level of prophecy. So it came through a tremendous amount of seclusion. So therefore he says the mystical meditation is the root of the divine inspiration of prophecy. Now, after the era of the prophets ended, we entered into the era of the great sages. Now, even when you study the Mishnah and you study the Gemara, we need to realize that the great authors of the Mishnah, like Rabbi Akiva and his friends, as we're soon going to meet, we're going to soon talk about this in a moment, they were great mystics, but they didn't write their mysticism in an open way because their students or the masses that were studying their words were not ready to study it or to understand it, and they could misuse it. So therefore they spoke in code. But we see in some places in the Talmud where the Talmud talks about their out-of-body kind of experience, and it was a total mystical experience. The other thing that mystical meditation does is it allows for soul elevation. We're going to read now something from Rabbi Hai Gaon, which Rabbi Hai Gaon, let me just explain from the historical perspective. After you had the prophets, you had the Anshe Knesset Agdola, the men of the Great Assembly that are mentioned in the Mishnah. You had the Tanoim, the Mishnaic authors. Then you had the Meroim, who were the Talmudic authors. After the Talmud was sealed, it entered in, mainly in Babylon, it entered into the era of the Gaonim. The Gaonim, today when you say a Gaon, you mean a prodigy, it means a prodigy. In those days, a Gaon was not only someone that had an encyclopedic mind, but someone that was very spiritual and was at the level of those great sages. Some of the famous Gaonim that are quoted even today is Rabbi Sadia Gaon. I'm sure people heard that name. Rabbi Nissim Gaon. The last of the Gaonim was Rabbi Hai Gaon. And Rabbi Hai Gaon writes something spectacular. If you give a look on page 45 in text 7. He says, you may be aware that in view of many of our great sages, there is a technique for individuals of extremely advanced character. And this is something that I mentioned before, based on what Maimonides writes, but he came before Maimonides, to experience the mystical visions of the divine chariot. Now, what is the divine chariot? The divine chariot is a code word in the Mishnah. It's called Maaseh Markava. And that is the prophecy that Ezekiel reveals, and we read it on Shavuot. So the angels in heaven surrounding God's throne as revealed to Ezekiel and others, and gaze into the spiritual chambers of angels and the like. They would fast for a designated amount of days, then place their head between their knees and whisper copious songs of praise to God with their faces towards the earth. This opened them to mystical visions and allowed them to experience roaming the heavens and exploring the supernal chambers with clarity. There are two works of the Mishnaic sages regarding this entitled Heichalot Rabati, the great chambers, and Heichalot Zutrati, the minor chambers. This is all very well known and was unanimously regarded by all sages as authentic. They insisted that God performs miracles and wonders through saintly individuals known as tzaddikim, just as he did with the prophets, and that God shows them awesome visions, just as he showed the prophets. So basically, what he's saying here is that although these Mishnaic sages dealt with legal matters in Judaism and formulated Jewish law and Jewish ritual and Jewish religion, but yet behind the scene, so to speak, beneath the surface, they were involved in this out-of-body mystical experience that they almost never revealed. Sometimes you find it in the Talmud, but most of the time not. Now, the purpose of saying that was not to say that that is the proof of how the law should be. It's just saying that a very interesting concept, and the concept is the following. And it's actually quoted by the Shalah that we read before. And that is that to whatever we see, there are many layers and layers and layers beneath it. So even in the physical world, there are examples of things that are layers. If you have a scientist that looks through his microscope to see things that the eye can't see, he discovers a whole new world. If you have people that go deep sea diving, they see marine life that is not visible. But just as that happens in the physical world, it's even more so in the spiritual world. And the Shalach famously said that everything that we see in the physical world mirrors what happens in the spiritual world and in the godly world. And not only that, because it's so in the godly world, therefore it is so in the physical world. And I'm going to give you one example before we go to the meditation. Last week, we talked about the 10 faculties, the 10 functions, the 10 powers that we have. So there's the intellectual and there's the emotional. In the emotional, on the right column, there's something which is called kindness, or also sometimes called love. So where does love come from? What's the origin of love? The origin of love is not a feeling that's in the human being. It was planted there by God that we should be able to love. And by the way, the concept of love is not what most people think love, like an animal that loves their child. Because that kind of love is self-love. It's self-serving. True love means that you're ready to put yourself away for someone else. There was a story that happened, I think it happened here in North Carolina, maybe in Concord, where there was a boyfriend and girlfriend walking along the tracks. And they didn't think that a train would come. And all of a sudden, a train was rushing to them. And there was not enough time for both of them to jump off the tracks. And what did the boyfriend do? He grabbed his girlfriend, threw her out of the way, but in the process, he was hit by the train and he died. So he would gain nothing out of it. It's not like later he could reflect and say, look what a good deed I have. Now love me more. In fact, his girlfriend was so upset that she said that because of this magnanimous act of love, she doesn't know how she can love anyone else because he made the ultimate sacrifice for her. She had to go to therapy to figure that out. So when we talk about love, love means to give of yourself unconditionally to someone else. Where does this come from? It comes from the faculty of chesed, the faculty of kindness that God created within the divine manifestation, which through this, because we were created in the image of God, we also have chesed. Not only that, it's also in the physical way. There is a physical item that is actually also rooted in chesed, and that is water. Water that flows. Why does water flow from above to below? Because it's liquid. But that nature of flowing, that in itself, that it's liquid, is a nature that God put into the water, and it represents the idea of chesed. So when you have someone that is able to see the deeper layers and they look at water, they're not only looking at water, they see love in water. They see true kindness, true altruism in water. It means giving of yourself. Because in water, what happens with water is when it leaves from its perch above, it's depleted and it enters into another place. It's the total giving. So when we meditate in a form where we're trying to transcend, what we're trying to do is to focus on the deeper levels, on the mystical aspect of life, which is very, very deep. And it is so deep because it's radiant with the divine, especially since it did not until recently lend itself to intellectual study. Now, it's a very difficult task to do. I cannot say in all righteousness that we can sit here and meditate and actually transcend into that level. Only a tzaddik can do that. I'll share a story with you. It's a story that the previous Rebbe told, and it gives us a little bit of an insight. So bear with me on this story. The previous Rebbe, the previous Rebbe says that the Baal Shem Tov was an inordinate mind. He was a very great scholar, mystical man, knew the entire Talmud. He had an encyclopedic mind, and he was surrounded by 60 disciples who themselves were geniuses and authors of great works on the Talmud. But yet he had a custom that he would extend himself to very simple people. When we talk about simple people, people that were totally uneducated, they barely could read, but they had a passion for Judaism. And when it would come Shabbat, he would invite them to his Shabbat table, and he would make sure that they all had to eat, and he would rejoice with them and smile to them and sing to them. And his students could never understand it. They couldn't understand why such a holy, mystical rabbi is so involved with the simple people. But he did have a custom that for the third meal of Shabbat, which is called Shalosh Sudas, after the Mincha prayer, that he would go into seclusion with his students. That was his private time with his students. And then he would reveal to them mystical concepts of the Torah. And at one of those times, and they would sing melodious tunes that would stir the passion of the soul as well. And at one point when they were experiencing that, they felt so close to him and they felt so elevated that one of them thought, why can't it always be that way? Why do we have to share all this with the simple people? Can't somebody else, can't the Baal Shem Tov delegate it to someone else that can teach them? Why is he involved with them? And it bothered them. And the Baal Shem Tov sensed that even though they did not articulate it, or they did not say it in words, they only meditated on it. The Baal Shem Tov became very serious, and he asked that they should form a circle, and everybody should place their hands on the shoulders of their neighbor. And this way they formed a circle, and then he put his hands on the two students that were around him. He told them to close their eyes, and they began a meditative song. And in this meditative song, the souls were able to elevate higher and higher. And all of a sudden, they were shocked. They began to hear these beautiful but terrifying voices of people saying, "Oh, sweet Father in heaven, help us." And they were reciting Tehillim. And one voice after another voice that was coming through that shocked them. It was so pure that it felt like angels are saying. And they couldn't believe it. And then it stopped. And when it stopped, he opened his eyes. The Baal Shem Tov opened his eyes, and he says, "You know whose voices they were? The simple people that are now in the sanctuary that are not with us, and they're reciting the Psalms. And they're reciting the Psalms with such feeling. And even though many of them don't even know the translation of the words, but they just feel connected in a pure way, and that's the impact that it's making in heaven. So the point of the matter is that they were at that level that they were able to hear things that ordinarily you can't hear. It wasn't that they just heard the voices. They heard the way it was penetrating the heavens. So all these layers are represented in the soul as well. You have the life force, which is the simplest part of the life force, which is called the nefesh. You have something which is deeper, which is called the ruach, the spirit. The spirit is something which rises above, but it doesn't, which that's what spirituality is. Then you have the neshama, which is the divine. And then you have even higher consciousness, which is the chayim yechida, which is the infinite aspect of the soul. Now, in Torah, you also have the same thing. Torah is called the orchard because it has 4 levels, which is called pardes. Pardes in Hebrew is an orchard. Pardes is made up of 4 Hebrew letters. Pshat, which is the simple meaning. Remez is the intimate or hints that are there, like numerology. Then you have the midrash, and then you have the sod, which is the mystical. Now, the sages, not all the sages were actually worthy of going into that orchard. But the Talmud in Chagiga tells us a fascinating story. And in fact, that's the part of the Talmud Chagiga that says that one should be very careful when they study mysticism and not teach it in public because it could be misused. And they give an example. Let's give a look on page 47, text number 8. So it says, our sages have taught 4 individuals entered the orchard, which is the pardes, which means that they explored the Torah's mystical secrets. They are Ben Azai, Ben Zoma. Ben Azai and Ben Zoma are mentioned in the Talmud numerous times. Many of you might recognize their name from Ethics of Our Fathers. Acher, Acher actually was Elisha ben Avuya, but he was called Acher because he chucked everything, so he was called the other one, and Rabbi Akiva. Then the Talmud continues and says, Ben Azai gazed at the divine presence and died. Why did he die? He didn't die as a punishment. He died because his soul had such a yearning to connect with the essence of God as he experienced it, and he saw no value of remaining in his body. So the soul just ascended upwards and became one with God. Ben Zoma gazed at the divine presence, and he knew that he can't leave yet, but he couldn't process what he saw. It was so beyond him that he became crazed. Acher gazed, and he chopped down the shoots of the saplings. In other words, he became a heretic. He said, I can't live in this duality. I can't stand to have that high level of spirituality and then be stuck in a physical body. But he knew he doesn't want to die. So he just dropped everything and he left it. Even though he was a genius, and the Talmud continues on that he would continue teaching Rabbi Meir. The only one who emerged safely was Rabbi Akiva. So what do we learn from here is that this kind of meditation is not necessarily safe for everyone. It's not something that everybody can achieve. Now, why did Rabbi Akiva emerge safely? For centuries and centuries, people would study it and nobody knew that. What's the answer? It says he entered in peace and he exited in peace. So what does it mean? The Rebbe once explained it, and I have to share that explanation with you because it's revolutionary. And listen to me carefully, because this is the crux of what we're studying about, even though the explanation is not in the text here. And that is the following. The other three, when they entered into the orchard, they were looking, how can I enhance my life? How can I grow? How can I become a better person? How can I become closer to God? So even though it was noble what they were doing, but the focus was on the I. How can I grow? So therefore, if it was about the I couldn't tolerate it. Rabbi Akiva never thought about the I. Rabbi Akiva, very interestingly enough, when he was being killed by the Romans, he smiled. And he said, all my life, I waited for the mitzvah of connecting to God. It didn't come my way, so I didn't do it. Now that I came, I smiled. Why? Because all of his life, all he was thinking about was not about the I, but what does God want from me? And his entry into that orchard was, perhaps I can learn something there that explains the mission that we all have for God, rather than my growth and my enhancement. It wasn't about himself. He was there to learn how the world can become a better place and what lessons he can take from that. And for that reason, it says that he went in peace. In other words, he didn't go in, he went in harmony with God. He didn't go with a selfish notion, even though it was a very noble selfish notion. He went in the right way. And this teaches us what this kind of meditation is about when it comes to Hitbodedut, that the mystical meditation is total surrender to the higher being, and it's not about ourselves. And that is, in reality, a very difficult task to achieve. So for that reason, the second idea that we introduced at the very beginning of the lesson tonight, which is the Hitbonenut, that is something which is much more accessible, and it's a proper meditation, and it actually helps us in a positive way. And that's called the Hitbonenut, and that is the kind of meditation which we call hyper-focused meditation. It is actually focusing on something else, on something deep. So the word Hitbonenut, remember I said Hitbodedut comes from the word bidud, which means seclusion. Hitbonenut, on the other hand, comes from the word bina. So Hitbodedut is the disengagement, which we said before. Hitbonenut is the hyper engagement with the soul. So that's where there is a very big difference. So let's talk about this for a second. What's hitbonenut? Hitbonenut is not the kind of meditation where you focus on something by emptying your mind, which is something like TM and transcendental meditation. Hitbonenut is actually focusing on a contemplative thought that you can understand. And it starts with the building blocks of studying. So let's say you study about the soul. So we were studying about the human soul, and the human soul is the part of God. What does it mean that it's the part of God? So it says that God didn't just speak the soul into the human body, he exhaled and blew it in. What is the idea of exhalation? Exhalation, when someone exhales, they first have to inhale. It's a kind of sign that of something that comes from deep within your essence, which means to say that the human soul, it comes from a much deeper level in God than any other creation, because all the other creations come from the speech of God, which is external to God. Speech is external. It's how to communicate with others. Breathing is internal. So we talk about the divine light of God, which is infinite, which is beyond any kind of limitations. It is what Kabbalah refers to as Or Ein Sof, a light that is endless. Infinity doesn't only mean in a quantitative way. Infinity doesn't only mean that it has no end. The true definition of infinity is a qualitative one, that it defies all kinds of limitations or boundaries. It's beyond the concept of space and time and numbers. It is the essence of purity in its own right. And when you think that that is the part that God had imbued within each and every one of us, so it's not just a light level of divine, but it's a true essence of divine. So we want to understand the mechanics of what it is. What is this essence? And how does it live? And how does it exist? And we realize that it can't exist just like light cannot exist without being constantly flowing from its source. Because if you cut life off from its source, the life dissipates. It doesn't continue on. So the soul is a constant flow of divine energy. It's a constant flow of holiness that's within us. So now we try to understand, how does this actually interact with us? How is it enclosed within us? So we have to study the deep mystical concepts, but the deep mystical concepts cannot remain in the abstract. They have to actually come down in a way that we can be able to understand it. And that takes a tremendous amount of intellectual exercise. So give it a look on page 49 in text 9. So he says, the central foundation of this study of mysticism is to repeatedly spend considerable time in deep contemplation on the subject matter being studied. This is the practice that is referred to as hitbonenut, which means to firmly visualize the concept and to analyze it deeply. When you study something, even if it makes sense at the first glance, my bet is that you're not going to remember it. And the reason you're not going to remember it is because it's passing through your brain. But if you focus on it, you study it and you analyze it, and you want to see if it really makes sense or not, and you look at the pros and the cons, and you see why is it yay, why is it nay, and you really connect with it, then it becomes one with you. And when we talk about the concept of God and godliness in the soul, there's a very interesting statement in the book of Deuteronomy. It's actually a well-known statement because we recite it in the ritual of Aleinu, the prayer of Aleinu, and it's V'yadaita hayom, you shall know today, V'ashevota elavecha, and you shall place it into your heart. What does it mean, and you should place it into your heart? If it's something that makes sense, why do you need to place it in your heart? Why do you have to take it to heart? So there are several explanations to it. It means, number one, that it should settle in your heart. In other words, your mind has to be able to absorb it to the point where you can actually allow it to manifest itself in your heart, and your heart is now in tune with that. So, and that's number one. And number two, it's by returning to it constantly and referencing to it that you actually do it that way. Let's see the way the Rabbeinu Bechaya speaks about this in text number 10 on page 15. Rabbeinu Bechaya was one of the Rishonim, and he writes the following. He says, you shall take it to heart. This is a positive commandment to know God. And let's stop there right now. What does it mean it's a positive commandment to know God? He's not saying it's a positive commandment to believe in God or to have faith in God. This goes beyond faith. This goes deeper than faith. Because the whole idea of faith is that you don't know it, so you accept it on faith. Here, the Torah is saying you need to know it. How do you need to know it? By studying it. Studying means to analyze it. Even though it's in the abstract, you have to take it out of the abstract and bring it into the reasoning and the logic of the mind. So he says we're enjoined to investigate and develop an appreciation of God's unity and not rely solely on received tradition. Let me stop here again. Unfortunately, many Jewish people do that. They do everything by rote, or they do everything because this was the tradition of our parents. Comes along the Torah and says that's not sufficient. It's absolutely not only insufficient. In some places it says it's like nullifying a mitzvah from God. And what does it mean, God's unity? God's unity means the oneness of God, not that there are no other gods, but that the composition of God is not made up of parts, and that there's nothing outside of God. However, since the spiritual understanding of the divine is abstract and not easily understood, the verse emphasizes that we must take it to heart. The Hebrew term for take it in the verse more literally means return it, indicating we must repeatedly contemplate the concept until it settles in our mind. The term take to heart always refers to a matter that requires profound concentration and extra focused thinking. So this meditative practice is totally the opposite of the departure. This is engaging. This is hyper focus on the concept by studying it, and then you actually are able to absorb it. The previous Rebbe gives an example for it. And he says in text 11a on page 51, Hitbonanut is an internal dialogue with an idea. Once we have studied something well, in all its fine details, explanations and commentaries, until we have developed a thorough understanding of it, the practice of Hitbonanut meditation is then to mentally analyze the idea, to verify whether our understanding is true and accurate of all of its details. Through diligent meditation, we develop a strong visualization of the soul of the concept, which is the animating core of the idea itself. And as Fruma Rosenberg writes in the text 11b, the Hasidic practice of Hitbonanut meditation involves actively contemplating a spiritual concept until it expands our creative intelligence, deepens our awareness, and becomes an indelible part of our consciousness. So it's hard work, but it's different than the abstract. It's different than disengagement. It's different than saying, okay, I'm going to go out into the woods and I'm going to surrender and not be myself. That is a very difficult task to do. However, if you do it in a positive way, that you focus on the mystical concepts that are there in writing, and you study them, and you begin to study them and to analyze them and focus on them and meditate on them. In fact, in Chabad Hasidus, the idea of prayer is to study, and then after the study, before prayers, to meditate on it, to think it through, and to connect with it, that it should truly resonate with us. And then when it resonates with us, then it brings out the feeling. And as it says in text 12, through honest contemplation with deep focus, a person's soul develops an authentic closeness and attachment with God, commensurate to their spiritual standing. Through this, one fulfills the mitzvah of loving God. So now, you want to daven, and you want to fulfill what it says in the Shema, V'ahavtas Hashem Elokecha, you shall love God. So you say, oh, I love God. But honestly, what does that mean that you love God? You love ice cream. You love something material. What does it mean you love God? How do you love God? Maimonides asked the question, how do you come to love God? It can only come through the Hitbonanut, Rambam says, through this meditation, through this study. If it comes a natural love, that's a love which is infantile. It could dissipate very, very quickly. But if you truly study it, then it becomes yours. Now, we're going to finish. There's 2 more things that we can do. There's actually 3 more things. But what we're going to do is actually do our own meditation by studying a text from Hasidus. And this, as I mentioned in the very beginning of the class, this takes it out of just the human soul and brings it to the soul of the world. And it makes us look at the physical world in a totally different way. It's actually based on the writings of Rabbi Shneir Zalman of Liadi in the Tanya, but it's written out in a little bit of a more interesting way. So let's go to text 13 on page 54. And I want us to read it slow and deliberately. Everything that exists is comprised of a physical form and a spiritual divine energy that creates and animates the entity's physical existence. This is clearly demonstrable in animals and humans. They have an animating spirit. If the spirit were to leave their body, the body would no longer be classified as alive, and the body would begin to decompose and turn to dust. That is because the very existence of the body hinges upon the spiritual energy that animates it. The same is true of vegetation. It also possesses an animating spirit. Even inanimate objects possess some sort of energizing spirit that keeps them in existence and prevents their disappearance. In other words, even the stone that was created by God has the word of God, which becomes its soul and keeps it alive. Based on this awareness, spirituality is referred to as good and life, because it is a living force that remains alive and in existence forever. Whereas physical matter is referred to as negative and death, because it decomposes and ceases to exist without the spirit within it, and it has no means of existing independently. From my flesh, I can perceive God, says in Job, meaning that the human experience informs our understanding of God. We intuitively sense that we have a life force that provides us with our life. And that is our primary identity. And that where our souls were to leave our body, the body would be left like an inanimate rock and eventually decompose and disappear. The same is true with all that exists. The entire cosmos and all its contents exist due to a divine spirit that gives existence to everything. That divine light and force is the entire life and sustaining power of all that exists. If it departs all existence, it will revert to absolute nothingness. If we meditate on this idea, we will realize that the material existence of each identity is entirely dependent on the spiritual force within it, and that physicality is nullified before the presence of the divine light that is its source of existence. This realization will inspire a powerful desire, love, and yearning for the divine. We will no longer desire that which exists only superficially and which is in fact death, decomposing and disappearing. All we will desire is to attach to the divinity that is true life and mainstay existence. I can read it again and again, and I will ask you if you can take 3 things out of this. And what are the 3 things that we learned from here? 3 basic ideas. One idea is that every physical thing has a soul. That's number 1. Right? The second thing is not only that everything has a soul, but that its true identity. And the third thing is that the soul, I'm not saying it in the right order. The second thing is actually that the soul is the source of its being. It brought it out and it keeps it, sustains it. And the third thing is its true identity. I'm going to give you an example. Give a look at page 56. Exercise. Everything has a body and soul. If you have dinner with a spouse and a close friend, what's the body and what's the soul? The getting together and having the meal is the body. The relationship is the soul. You're getting together not just to enjoy food, you're getting together to have a relationship. Okay, another example is disciplining a child. What's the body and what's the soul? The body is the act of discipline. The soul is to teach the child a lesson, and it's a loving lesson that the child should behave properly. Exercising at the gym. The body is the workout. The soul are the results. You want to live a better life. Shaking hands on a deal. There was an article once in Time magazine going back in the 60s about the fact that in the 57th Street area of Manhattan, which is called the Diamond District, there was never any contracts written amongst the diamond merchants. It was all word of honor. But if they shook hands, they would say Mazel Tov, and the deal was made. So what's the body? The body is the shaking of the hands. The soul is that the deal is made. But let's say you take two people and force them to shake the hand, but they don't have a deal. You have a dead body, but you don't have the deal. What are we saying here? We're saying here is the following. When it says in the Torah, choose life, the goodness and life, don't choose death. The question that is asked is, who wants to choose death? Everybody wants to live. Even an animal wants to live. Why does the Torah say choose life? So the deeper explanation is, choose life that when you're in the physical moment, look at the soul of it. Don't just be enamored with the body. Don't be distracted by the body. Look at the soul. When you see another human being, don't judge them by the way they dress or by the way they look. Judge them, or at least have a relationship with their soul, with their inner being. The same thing is true with anything that you engage in. A shallow way of looking at life is just ascertaining it by its externality, by how attractive it is, but not realizing that there is a soul. The soul is the main aspect of it. And this is what we're saying here, to contemplate that in the world, when you look at a stone, think of it this way. The previous Rebbe once said to his students, when you come up to heaven, the pavement that you walked on will stand before God and before the heavenly tribunal and accuse you of stepping on it like an animal and not utilizing it in a spiritual way. But have you thought words of Torah or recited words of Torah, then you're elevating the pavement as well, because it has a soul. We have one more meditative video of Label Wolf. It's very short. I will show it to you right after this picture. So why are we having this piece of art? Now, a keen eye will notice that the piece of art is a nice painting. It was painted by Rabbi Zalman Kleiman. He actually lived in our neighborhood. And trademark in his painting is he had one son, and he always put his son in the painting. So the little boy with the yarmulke and the hands in his pocket, that's a side profile of his son. But anyways, but he is not in the picture. But if you look very closely, you see that this is a work of art. What's the soul of this painting? It's not just lines and colors. There's a moment there where the whole family is focused on a mitzvah. It's obviously the night of Hanukkah, and the father is lighting the candles, and all the children are enamored with it. They're elevated by the holiness of the night. So they're not worried about what's going on around them. They are enamored with the flame. That's the soul of the picture. When you look at the world and you see the sun rising and the sun setting, you need to see the divine. You know, according to Hasidic philosophy, it says that the Shekhinah is in the west. And the reason that the sun sets in the west is because it's singing praise to God, and it's bowing and surrendering to God in the West, a concept. It shines in the front in the East, that's where the revelation begins.
Spirituality means to sense viscerally how meaningful every single moment and item of life is, which means to enter into a relationship soul to soul, and we can do so with everything that we find in our daily activities. So gently close your eyes and just become aware of a source of light in your head, pleasant, warm, spreading throughout your head space, enlightening, animating, and flowing down into your lower body, feeling comfortable and warm. Intensify that light source so it spreads through your limbs, allowing them to feel animated, special, with Hashem's light, that light which is your soul's light. Everything possesses a soul spark. The stone also has a soul. If you peer into the stone and are able to see molecules, atoms, smaller particles even, all these are energies that are manifested. Beneath each of these lies a spiritual force. The spiritual force of a stone is nefesh. A flower also possesses a soul spark, but it's more developed. It's called ruach, allowing the flower to have locomotion, movement, growth, inclination towards the sun. It has both nefesh and ruach. The animal has an even more advanced soul system. It has the nefesh to maintain its physical state, ruach providing it with animation, movement, but also neshama, which provides it with rudimentary communication capacity. And then there's the human being, who possesses all three, plus the level of soul known as chaya, the level of soul that provides consciousness, awareness of the flow of time, present, past.
Sorry about that. I'm going to get back to it. This technology.
So neshama, which provides it with rudimentary communication capacity. And then there's the human being, who possesses all three, plus the level of soul known as chaya, the level of soul that provides consciousness, awareness of the flow of time, present, past, and future, hopes, aspirations, values, beliefs. We encounter all four levels in life. Allow that encounter to be soul to soul, recognizing that everything possesses value, godliness, purpose, and only by relating spiritually to the essence of that soul do we connect meaningfully. Live a deep and meaningful life.
Okay, so what do we take from this whole lesson that we learned tonight is actually something fascinating, that it's not just that we are replacing our thoughts with positive ideas, but it's actually more than that. And that is that we're able to reach into a higher level of consciousness, which is beyond what you normally encounter. And when you see that, we're going to see this in the future lessons as well, that you begin to see the hand of God in everything. You begin to see the divine spark in everything. You then are able to transcend the regular being, and all of the world comes into harmony with your life. So rather than seeing the world, the bustling world, as a distraction, and rather than seeing the physical needs as something which is driving you elsewhere, try to see the spirituality that's in it, harness it, bring it together, focus on it, and you're able to lift yourself from the day-to-day worries. You're able to lift yourself into the mission that we have, which is to reveal the divine in every aspect of life. It sounds like it takes a lot of work. It's definitely more than what we studied last week, but it's very doable. We started slowly with small pieces. And I would like to suggest that this text that we read before, which was the meditative text on page 54, text 13, which is called the soul existence, I would suggest that that's something do you reread a few times during this week until the next class. Study it, try to understand it, see what it means that everything in the world has a soul, and that the soul is the root of every existence. And not only that, it's its true identity. And then see how it relates to the world around you, and you will see a much more positive environment. Thank you very much. We ran out of time. I appreciate it. And sorry for the technical difficulties.
Lesson 2.
Yes. Thank you. Yes, you could.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.